Welcome to this lesson on learning design processes and models. The purpose of this lesson is to build on our introduction to the learning design field by exploring roles and stages within a commonly used design process. You should be able to recognize several of the ideas we discussed in past lessons as we look in greater detail at how designers work through the process of planning and creating curriculum and learning objects. In past lessons, we were introduced to the field of learning and instructional design. We learned that design has to do with how we plan and create things like curriculum, learning objects, and learning environments that help people maximize their learning. We also learned several principles to guide our design process related to teaching and communicating effectively. Lastly, we learned that there are different educational schools like behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism that approach teaching and learning design from different perspectives. In this lesson, we will build on the terminology and principles introduced in past lessons by looking at one particular design process in greater detail. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to list and describe the various roles of people in the design process, list the three types of the design models, and articulate each stage of the common design process ADDI and justify why each stage is important. Depending on the context of the organization or community requiring instructional design, many different people can be involved in the design process besides the designer, including instructors and teachers, facilitators and trainers, subject matter experts, managers, and learners, students, trainees, or participants. In traditional educational settings, instructors and teachers may need to develop learning materials for their students, for example in creating unit and lesson plans, creating tests or textbooks and other media. Such teachers often need to situate their design products into predefined curriculum requirements and goals, for example to meet general learning objectives for various grades set by the government. In corporate, government, and non-government organizations, rather than traditional instructors or teachers, there may be facilitators or trainers whose jobs require them to improve employee knowledge and skills related to specific organizational objectives. Like instructors, facilitators and trainers share curriculum with others, but they usually facilitate in consultations, short-term workshops, just-in-time training, or on-the-job training rather than longer-term courses. Because designers specialize in developing curriculum and learning objects, subject matter experts often are consulted to ensure that the most appropriate content is used. These experts often work closely with designers, who then take this content and develop educational and training materials using the most appropriate delivery methods and media for the given audience. Organizational managers may also play a role in the design process by setting goals, determining schedules, and managing staff and resources. In traditional primary or secondary education, they may be administrators or school district or ministry employees. In traditional higher education, they could be faculty or departmental chairs or committees. In the corporate, government, and non-government sectors, they may be managers whose job it is to set goals and oversee and train others in the organization to meet organizational objectives. Lastly, the final consumers of the educational or training program or product play the most important role in the design process. They might be called learners or students in traditional education, or trainees or participants in government, non-government, or corporate contexts. Some constructivists react negatively to the terms training, trainer, and trainee, as they feel these terms connote an extreme behaviorist orientation, emphasizing rote memorization and conformity without building creative and critical awareness. In the public and private sector, these terms are often used, so in this course I refer to the consumers of education and training in various ways to be as inclusive as possible of the different contexts of learning design. I therefore may call them learners, students, participants, and trainees depending on the context. We now know that as a designer, you may be working with many others when planning and creating curriculum or learning objects. Depending on the size of the organization and the resources available for education and training, you may also find yourself filling several of these roles simultaneously. Now that we know who is involved in the design process, we'll look more closely at the design process itself. It's important to recognize that different processes might be used depending on what is being designed. We've loosely defined instructional design as creating and planning things to support the learning of a given audience. In the literature, the various models that have been proposed are sometimes categorized into three types or approaches that build in complexity. These include the classroom approach to design, the product approach to design, and the system approach to design. Typically, the classroom approach is the most basic type of instructional design. These types of design models are generally used by teachers who use a design process to develop lesson plans and smaller instructional units. They usually don't develop any new curriculum or learning objects. Instead, they work with already created content using a design process to find the best way to organize it and present it to a group of learners. Typically, the product approach assumes that an instructional product like a manual, video, learning object, and so on should be created to meet a training or learning need. The amount of time to create the product varies, but this requires a greater amount of design and technological experience than the classroom approach, as new products must be planned and created. Like the classroom approach, the amount of learning required might be smaller. Typically, the system approach is the most complex type of a design, requiring a great deal of analysis and planning to meet broader educational or training objectives, rather than the classroom approach, which is used to create smaller lessons, or the product approach, which is used to create learning objects. The system approach focuses on developing larger courses or curriculum. This, of course, requires the most amount of resources and design expertise, as many different products and delivery methods may be used. Depending on the needs of your learners or organization, you may find that you need to use different design processes. If you need to design learning environments and activities for a group of students using existing resources, you'll want to use a fast and easy process model that focuses on the classroom approach to design. If you need to develop the resources yourself to meet a specific training or educational need, you want to use a more in-depth design process that focuses on the product approach to design. Lastly, you may find yourself in an organization that needs to plan a larger system of education and training that must meet many needs and outcomes. In this scenario, you'll need to take the broadest and most complex approach that will help you plan a series of products, activities, and environments that best meet the organization's larger training and educational needs. There are many different processes discussed in the instructional design literature, and you and your classmates will investigate these further in your first e-lecture assignment. As you investigate them further, you'll likely find that they often have many overlaps in stages or concepts. Here, we're going to look at a fairly simple and very popular ADDIE model, which stands for Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. Although this model is often used in government and corporate contexts, it can also be useful in educational settings when specific desired behaviors can be defined for the learners. The main purpose of the analysis stage is to gather all the data necessary to make better design decisions for a given educational or training problem. There are many types of analysis you may need to do and many ways to collect data to inform your analysis. Here are some of the types of analysis we'll discuss further, which you can do when determining training and educational needs. Job analysis, criticality analysis, task analysis, learning analysis, and audience analysis. When doing a job analysis, you break down the tasks necessary to do a complex job. By carefully describing all of the tasks required for a given job, you can identify the training needs for those hired for it. To gather data about a job, you might observe, survey, or interview current employees, managers, or subject matter experts. For example, you may be hired to create a professional development program for teachers in a school district. To do this, you will first need to answer several questions about what types of training are needed by the teachers for them to master the various tasks of their profession. To do this, you might observe a random sample of teachers in the classroom, create an online survey, interview school principals, and talk to teacher educators at universities to determine what the teachers currently do as well as what they should do. After this data gathering, your goal would be to create a list of tasks and practices that teachers must ideally know and do well. Criticality analysis refers to the prioritization of tasks for a given job to determine which tasks require training. You can determine if a task is important for training by asking questions about how often the task is required, how hard it is, how important it is to the job's success, and how much training is required to be proficient at it. Once complete, the criticality analysis will give you a prioritized list of tasks that employees must know to gain mastery in a given job. For example, you might prioritize a list of tasks for teachers, like lesson planning, speaking engagingly in class, motivating learners, communicating with parents, collaborating with other teachers and administration, and so on. After your criticality analysis, you may determine that some of these tasks are more vital than others for teachers when it comes to promoting student success and learning. Task analysis helps you look deeper into the various tasks of a job by identifying the specific knowledge and skills required to do the task well. Task analysis can help you clarify the steps, tools, problems, and conditions for each task you investigate. For example, when breaking down the teacher's task of motivating learners, you may determine from your observations and consultations that more successful teachers in the district have interpersonal and communication skills that help them develop very positive personal relationships and connections with their students. You may also have found that during your interviews these teachers believe in some various theories of motivation, mentoring, and child psychology when describing how and why they create these relationships. Using this deeper information, you can then further define the specific types of training that may be useful for all teachers in the district to master the task of motivating learners. Because job, criticality, and task analysis takes a lot of time, you may choose instead to conduct a learning analysis. In a learning analysis, you take whatever resources you can find to define the training need and program yourself and gather information about the content you should cover. Where the previous types of analysis require primary research, learning analysis might be thought of as secondary research. For example, instead of researching jobs and tasks yourself, you might look at similar training programs, talk to subject matter experts, and inventory available resources to guide your design. In our teacher training example, instead of observing, surveying, and interviewing people in the school district, you might sit down with school district managers and teacher educators at the local university to draft a list of training topics based on the goals and knowledge of those you speak with. You would then prioritize that list of topics and, using similar programs and whatever resources you can find, design your training and education programs and products. Audience analysis is a type of analysis that specifically focuses on the needs and desires of the intended audience for your training. This analysis is essentially the same as needs assessment, which we've discussed briefly in previous lessons. Here, you gather as much information as you can about your audience. For example, you might survey and interview them to determine how, if, why, when, and where they want to be trained or educated, what the ideal training methods or media might be, what their motivations are for training, and what challenges they may have in their duties. For example, when analyzing the teachers within the district, you may want to know their ages, genders, teacher training and experiences, topics of interest for training, cultural and language differences, geographic locations, motivations or sources of apathy, and their schedules. All of this data can help you better design training materials that will be more successful for this given audience. Without audience analysis or needs assessment, you can create training materials that might not be of interest or used by your audience, that might not be delivered using the best methods or media, that might not focus on needed skills or topics, and so on. We now know that there are many different types of analysis, and each type can give us better information about the needs of our audience as well as the needs of the job they are required to do. By focusing on job tasks, many of these types of analysis are obviously relevant to workforce training, but they can be just as relevant to traditional education. For example, rather than asking what tasks a specific employee must master during a job analysis, as a teacher, you can ask what tasks a student must master at the end of a lesson, course, unit, or year. You can then prioritize those tasks, define the required knowledge and skills for the prioritized tasks, research existing resources, and conduct a needs assessment on your class. After completing the analysis stage, you'll want to begin planning the educational products and curriculum. The main purpose of the design stage is to create a plan for the outcomes, assessments, content, and delivery methods of the training. Designing these elements in this order is also called backwards design, an educational term used to describe lesson and curriculum planning that begins with defining the desired results or goals, then defining the evidence or assessments required, and lastly, defining the learning experiences and instruction. Having determined and prioritized the skills and knowledge required for given tasks or behaviors, you need to make decisions about what key learning outcomes must be met in the products and curriculum you design. Learning outcomes, sometimes called objectives or goals, are measurable actions that the student must demonstrate after participating in a learning event. You may recall from past lessons that learning outcomes can be categorized into different domains, including cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. We will discuss how to write and categorize learning outcomes in much greater detail in later lessons, but for now, know that designers must clearly define outcomes near the beginning of the design stage of the EDCI process. Because they describe measurable actions, outcomes also help the designer know how the learner will be assessed and measured. The designer will need to know if, when, and how well the learner must meet the outcomes, so they will need to include methods of assessment in their curriculum or training product. This might be a written test to demonstrate memorization or articulation of concepts, a physical demonstration of a skill, written reflections over time that demonstrate the use of a skill in the workplace, and so on. Without assessment, the designer and the learner won't know how much learning took place. Once you have outcomes and assessments defined, you can start to make decisions about the content of the training. This includes what information is included and what activities will help the participants actively learn this information. Based on your prior analysis and design, you should already have a prioritized list of desired skills and knowledge for the participants, as well as their associated learning outcomes. You now need to decide what information and activities are required to best teach those outcomes. We will discuss learning activities in greater detail in later lessons, but for now, know that when making decisions about the information to include in the training, you need to consider such ideas as active versus passive learning, chunking, sequencing, and reinforcement. Active versus passive learning links with our prior lessons on learning-centered teaching. You may recall that learner-centered teaching requires that we design learning events that make the learner the active agent as much as possible. As designers, this means that we need to make choices about how the learner will engage the content. If we aren't careful designers, we may default to teacher-centered instruction, where students passively receive content through lectures and readings rather than actively constructing knowledge with carefully chosen learning activities. Lecturing plays a role in giving learners foundational concepts and knowledge, but designers should move towards active learning whenever possible to support learner engagement, praxis, teamwork, and so on. Chunking refers to how you divide the information up into manageable units that don't overload or frustrate your participants. For example, you need to consider how much text should go on your flip charts, in your PowerPoint slides, or in each chapter or section of your manuals, or how long your lectures or learning activities should be. Sequencing refers to the order of the chunked information that you teach. You want to make sure that the information and skills you include go from simple to complex, and that the foundational skills and concepts are taught early so secondary skills and concepts can build on them. Reinforcement refers to the need to reiterate and repeat core concepts and skills to ensure the participants learn them well and integrate them into their practice. For example, you want to make sure you remind participants of concepts and skills that were taught previously and how new concepts and skills are connected to those taught previously. Introductions and summaries in your learning objects and lessons can play a big role in reinforcement. Following your decisions about content, you'll need to make careful choices about the methods of delivery for your training. Depending on the needs of your audience, the knowledge and skills required, as well as the resources available, you should select one or more methods of instruction or training. For example, you might choose between instructor-led classrooms, on-the-job training, self-instruction, technology-based training, job performance aids, training by documentation, and blended delivery. With instructor-led classrooms, there must be trainers and instructors present in the organization, as well as a site for people to meet for face-to-face instruction. This delivery method is useful when interaction, questions and answers, and control of outcomes is necessary, but participants must be available for a longer period of training time. With on-the-job training, no classroom is required, but a trainer is likely present. This delivery method is useful when authentic practice in the work environment is important and training time is limited. With self-instruction, no trainer or instructor is used, but a structured program is present. This delivery method is useful when just-in-time training or lots of repetition is needed, and training must be delivered across multiple sites. However, design time can be long, and questions and answers and interaction can be very limited. With technology-based training, it can either be instructor-facilitated, self-instructed, or both, but training is mediated by computers and/or the internet. Like self-instruction, this delivery method is useful when just-in-time training or lots of repetition is needed, and training must be delivered across multiple sites. It is also useful when multimedia, virtual environments, and virtual communication can support learning. Also like self-instruction, design time can however be long, and questions and answers and interaction can be limited. Job performance aids are not necessarily training, but they include learning products that support employees in their specific tasks. This type of method is useful when tasks are performed infrequently, when tasks must be performed precisely, or when tasks change frequently. Also not necessarily an example of training. Training by documentation includes instructional and procedural manuals given to staff and used for reference when doing a job. Lastly, blended delivery methods are a mixture of more than one of the other methods. For example, training might include a face-to-face instructor-led course mixed with online self-instruction when participants are in the workplace or in a practicum. Now that we've looked at the design stage, we'll move on to quickly review the final 3 stages of ADDI. After your analysis and design, the main purpose of the development stage is to create the end products you've articulated in your design. Depending on your chosen mode of delivery, your end products might look very different. For example, they might be lesson plans and instructional materials, manuals and training guides, participant packages, CD or DVD ROMs, online training sites, or other types of learning objects. After you've developed your training products or curricula, you must then implement them. A key thing to think about when first implementing your design is beta testing to systematically review your new products and curricula before officially using them. Beta tests are the first time you receive feedback from a live audience. During a beta test, you may want to include some representative trainers or instructors, subject matter experts, managers, and participants. When gathering feedback from them, you may consider focus groups, surveys, or interviews to see what elements of your design were most and least useful to the testers. Gathering such information, determining its relevance and worth, and redesigning can take time, so your design schedule should allow for this before your program or product must be fully implemented. The final stage of the ADDI design process, evaluation, is key to ensuring that your training program is effective and improves over time. Some representations of the ADDI model stress the importance of evaluation so much that they place it at the center of diagrams, highlighting that evaluation takes place during each of the other stages. There are different types and levels of evaluation for educational products and curriculum, which I'll introduce now, but spend much more time articulating in later lessons. These include reaction, learning, behavior, and results. In this lesson, we've looked at several new things. We now know that there are various roles that people play in the design process. We also know that there are many different models that explain learning and instructional design processes, which have been categorized into 3 types: classroom models, product models, and system models. We were introduced to our first model called ADDI and focused in detail on the types of analysis we may do as designers, as well as the various elements we need to consider when designing, like outcomes, assessments, content, and delivery methods. In the lesson, we were also introduced and reintroduced to several terms, including backwards design, outcomes, chunking, sequencing, reinforcement, and beta testing. Now that you've completed the lesson, your task is to review the key terms and ideas outlined for this topic in the course website. You should also review the course site for other important tasks you should complete to begin designing your own lesson on a design framework. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions about any lessons or course assignments, please feel free to email me.